She belongs here too. That whisper cut through the room louder than any shout. Elizabeth Carter heard it. Every single word. She kept walking anyway, head up, spine straight, heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her fingertips. She had been invited to this dinner to be humiliated. She understood that the moment she saw her seat number, and the man beside her, the coldest, most untouchable gentleman in all of Virginia, had not looked at her once. Until the wine spilled, until his hand moved, until everything in that room changed forever. Subscribe now and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The summer of 1817 came to Richmond, Virginia, like it always did, hot, heavy, and unforgiving. The kind of heat that pressed down on everything. On the tobacco fields stretching out beyond the hills. On the wooden storefronts along the main road. On the shoulders of women who worked from before sunrise until long after the candles burned low. Elizabeth Carter felt that heat every single morning when she rose before her father to prepare his breakfast, set his papers in order, and help him carry the broadsheets to the door of the Richmond Courier before the town was even fully awake. She was 26 years old. She had her mother's dark eyes and her father's stubborn jaw. She wore her brown hair pinned back in a simple style. Nothing fancy, nothing meant to impress. Her dresses were clean and carefully pressed, but anyone with a practiced eye, and in Richmond there were plenty of those, could see that the blue dress she wore on the evening of July the 14th had been let out at the seams and mended twice at the cuffs. She knew they could see it. She wore it anyway. The invitation had come 3 days earlier, a small ivory card sealed with the Pembroke family crest. Delivered not by a regular messenger, but by a young boy in a pressed uniform, which was itself a statement. Her father had held the card for a long time before he handed it to her. "Charlotte Pembroke is inviting you to her summer dinner," he said slowly. "Why would she do that, Eliza?" Elizabeth had looked at the card, at the careful curling script, at the words Miss Elizabeth Carter written with a flourish that somehow felt more like a warning than a welcome. "I don't know, Papa," she said. But she had a feeling. She had felt it the week before, when she overheard Charlotte Pembroke in the dry goods store on Broad Street speaking just loudly enough to be heard. Someone ought to teach that newspaper girl that reading broadsheets does not make a woman a lady. There had been laughter. 3 or 4 women, their voices bright and sharp as cut glass. Elizabeth had kept her eyes on the shelf in front of her. She had picked up the jar of dried herbs she came for, paid for it quietly, and walked out with her back straight. She did not look back. But she heard it. She always heard it. And her father tried to talk her out of going. "Eliza," he said, sitting across from her at the kitchen table that evening, his hands wrapped around his coffee cup. "These people, they aren't kind. You know that." "I know, Papa." "Then why would you walk into their house?" Elizabeth looked at him, at the lines around his eyes, at the ink stains on his fingers that never fully washed away. Her father was a good man, a man who had built something with his hands and his words, and she had watched Richmond's finest families look right through him for 30 years. She set her jaw. "Because if I don't go," she said quietly, "they win before anything even happens." Her father was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded. "Your mother used to say something like that," he said. "I know." Elizabeth smiled just a little. "She said it to me." The Pembroke mansion sat at the top of a long, curving drive lined with oak trees. By the time Elizabeth arrived on foot, because she had not wanted to borrow her neighbor's old cart and give anyone another reason to stare, the evening was already underway. Lantern light spilled from the tall windows. The sound of conversation and laughter drifted through the warm air. She paused at the bottom of the front steps. Just for a moment, she pressed her hand against the front of her dress, felt her own heartbeat, fast, faster than she wanted it to be. "They cannot have this," she told herself. "They cannot have your fear." She climbed the steps. The doors opened into the entrance hall, and the first thing Elizabeth noticed was the silence. Not a complete silence. People were still talking. Glasses still clinked somewhere across the room. Someone was laughing at something that had been said. But there was a particular kind of quiet that moved through a crowd when someone unexpected walked in. A pulling back, a turning of heads, a shifting of attention that was subtle enough to pretend it wasn't happening, and obvious enough that everyone felt it. They felt her, and she felt them feeling her. Charlotte Pembroke appeared from the crowd like she had been waiting, which Elizabeth realized immediately she had been. Charlotte was everything that Richmond society admired. Tall, fair-skinned, with golden hair swept up in perfect ringlets, and a yellow silk gown that probably cost more than Elizabeth's father made in 2 months. She moved through a room like she owned it. She did own it, or her family did, which amounted to the same thing. "Miss Carter?" Charlotte's smile was wide and warm, and about as genuine as a stage curtain. "How wonderful that you came." "Thank you for the invitation," Elizabeth said, even, measured. "Of course, we are always delighted to broaden our circle." Charlotte tilted her head slightly, and her eyes moved just for a fraction of a second over Elizabeth's dress, the mended cuffs, the let-out seams. "You look charming." The pause before charming was a blade. Elizabeth smiled. "As do you." Charlotte held out the small card, the dinner seating assignment. "Seat 7, she said brightly. "Right at the center of the table, the best view of the room." Elizabeth took the card and looked down at it. Seat 7. She glanced at the long dining table being arranged across the room, and her eyes found the place cards already set. And then her heart did something that she would not later be able to fully explain. It did not stop. Not exactly, but it lurched. Because Seat 6, directly beside Seat 7, bore the name Mr. Nathaniel Whitmore. Every person in Richmond knew that name. Nathaniel Whitmore was not the kind of man you forgot once you'd heard of him. He owned more land than any man under 40 in the state of Virginia. His family name was older than the Republic itself. His grandfather had sat in the Virginia House of Burgesses. His father had ridden with men who helped write laws that still stood, and Nathaniel himself was well. He was the man everyone talked about and no one truly knew. He was tall, dark-haired, broad-shouldered, in the way of men who had grown up on working land rather than merely inheriting it. He had a face that might have been handsome if he ever arranged it into any expression other than the one he typically wore, closed still distant, like a door shut firmly against the weather. He had attended every required social function for the past 3 years without speaking more than 10 words to anyone who wasn't directly asking him a question. He danced at exactly 1 dance per ball, always with the hostess's eldest daughter, always out of obligation, never out of pleasure, and he left every event early. He was not unkind exactly. He was simply absent, even when he was standing right in front of you. And Charlotte Pembroke had seated Elizabeth directly beside him. Elizabeth understood immediately. This was not an honor, this was a performance. And she was the evening's entertainment. "Gee." Charlotte leaned in just slightly close enough that her words were meant for Elizabeth alone, but loud enough that the 2 women standing nearest could catch them. "I thought perhaps you might draw him out," Charlotte said sweetly. "You're so good with words, Miss Carter. Being a newspaper girl and all." The 2 nearby women covered their smiles with their fans. Elizabeth looked at Charlotte for exactly 3 seconds. "I'll do my best," she said. She walked toward the table. Every step felt measured. She was aware of herself in a way that she hated, aware of her dress, of her shoes, of the way the other women's silk skirts rustled against the floor, and hers did not. She was aware of the voices that didn't lower quite enough as she passed. She heard, "Her father runs that little paper on Broad Street." "She's been coming to these events for 2 seasons now. Someone ought to tell her." "Nathaniel won't speak to her. He won't speak to anyone." That's the point, isn't it? Laughter, low, certain. Elizabeth reached Seat 7. She pulled it out herself because the footman standing nearby had turned slightly to speak to another guest, and she was not about to stand there waiting, and she sat down. She placed her card on the table. She smoothed her skirt. She folded her hands. And she waited. Nathaniel Whitmore arrived at his seat 3 minutes later. He did not look at her when he sat down. He placed his jacket perfectly settled, his hands on the table, and turned his attention to some fixed point across the room, not looking at anything in particular, just looking away. Elizabeth studied him for a moment. His jaw was tight. His shoulders were set with a tension that suggested he was not here by choice. There were faint lines around his eyes that didn't quite match his age, the kind of lines that came not from laughter, but from something heavier. She turned away. The soup arrived. For the first 15 minutes, no one at that table spoke to Elizabeth directly. The conversation flowed around her like water around a stone, present moving entirely deliberate in its exclusion. She ate her soup. She listened. She watched. And then Charlotte, seated at the head of the table, raised her voice just slightly, just enough to shift the room's attention, and smiled down the length of the table at Elizabeth with that same wide, warm, empty smile. "Miss Carter," she said, "I must ask. You attend so many of our gatherings. Tell me, what does it feel like sitting at a table like this, among families whose names have carried weight in this state for generations?" The room went still. Not fully, not dramatically, but the particular stillness of people pretending to continue their own conversations while listening with their entire bodies. Every eye not looking directly at Elizabeth was still watching her. Charlotte tilted her head. "I only ask because I imagine it must feel rather elevating." The word elevating landed like a stone in standing water. Elizabeth set her fork down. She did it slowly, deliberately. Not because she was composing herself, she was already composed, but because she wanted the sound of that fork against the china to register. It did. She looked at Charlotte. "I suppose every family must begin somewhere," Elizabeth said. "Even yours." Silence. Pure silence. And then one of the gentlemen, near the far end of the table, made a sound that was almost a laugh. A real one. The kind that escapes before it can be caught. A woman across from Elizabeth looked down quickly, but not before Elizabeth saw the corner of her mouth move. Charlotte's smile stayed in place, but something behind her eyes shifted. "How very philosophical," Charlotte said after a beat. "I have access to a great many books," Elizabeth said pleasantly. "Working in a newspaper office does have its advantages." The dinner continued. The courses came and went. Roasted duck, fresh bread, corn and cream sauce. The kind of food that had been arranged specifically to remind everyone present of exactly how much it cost. Nathaniel said nothing. He ate. He responded when directly addressed in short, sufficient sentences that closed conversations more efficiently than any dismissal Elizabeth had ever witnessed. He was not rude. He was simply impenetrable. But twice she noticed it, he glanced at her. Not long, not obviously. Just a flicker of those dark eyes in her direction, quick as a bird moving through shadow, and then gone again. The second time it happened, she was mid-sentence in a quiet exchange with the older woman seated across from her, a Mrs. Haverford, who had asked in genuine curiosity about her father's newspaper, and she felt rather than saw it. She did not look back, but she filed it away. It was during the final course that it happened. A young servant, barely 17, Elizabeth guessed nervous in the way of someone new to the job, was moving along the table, refilling wine glasses, when his foot caught on the edge of the heavy table runner. The tray tilted. The full glass of red wine tipped directly toward Elizabeth. Everything slowed. She saw it coming. She pulled back, but not fast enough, not with the table's edge right behind her, and the chair not giving her enough room to. And then something moved beside her. Fast. Certain. A hand shot out across the table, not catching the glass, but bracing the servant's tray from beneath, steadying it, redirecting the pour so that the wine splashed into the empty bread plate instead of across Elizabeth's dress. She felt the pressure of a hand close over hers where it had gripped the table's edge. Warm, firm, still. She turned her head. Nathaniel Whitmore was looking at her. Not across the room. Not past her. At her. His hand was over hers. He had not yet let go. The entire table had gone completely silent. Not the polite silence of people pausing their conversations. The struck dumb silence of people witnessing something they had not expected and could not immediately process. Because Nathaniel Whitmore, the man who did not touch anyone, did not speak to anyone, had spent 3 years building a wall around himself so high and so solid that Richmond society had simply accepted it as architecture, was holding Elizabeth Carter's hand. In public. At Charlotte Pembroke's dinner table, in front of everyone. Chul. He seemed to realize it a moment after everyone else did. His eyes dropped to their hands. He did not pull away immediately. That was the thing that Elizabeth would think about later, lying awake in the dark of her small room above her father's print shop, listening to the night sounds of the street below. He did not pull away. He looked at their joined hands for 2 full seconds, and then slowly, deliberately, not with embarrassment, not with apology, but with a carefulness that she could not quite name, he released her hand and straightened in his chair. The servant had recovered, was murmuring apologies. Someone was already redirecting attention, calling for a replacement cloth, filling the sudden silence with practical noise. But the noise could not undo what had happened. Charlotte Pembroke, from her position at the head of the table, looked at Elizabeth with an expression that was no longer smiling. And Elizabeth looked down at her own hand still resting on the tablecloth where Nathaniel had placed it. She could still feel the warmth of it. She did not know what it meant. She was not sure he did either. But she knew with a certainty that settled into her bones the way truth always did, quiet and unasked for, and impossible to argue with, that the evening had not gone the way Charlotte Pembroke had planned. The dinner ended an hour later. Guests began to move toward the parlor, toward the front hall, toward the carriages waiting in the drive. The room broke apart into smaller clusters, voices rising again with the freedom of finished formalities. Elizabeth rose from her seat. She was reaching for her evening bag when she heard Charlotte's voice, not directed at her, but clothes meant to carry. "Well," Charlotte said to the 2 women beside her, all 3 of them positioned just near enough to ensure they were overheard. "I suppose even a newspaper girl can cause a scene if she tries hard enough." One of the women laughed. The other one said a little more cautiously, "Do you think he meant to—" "Of course not," Charlotte said. It was reflex. He would have done the same for anyone. A pause. "Wouldn't he?" The second woman was quiet. Elizabeth did not turn around. She picked up her bag. She smoothed the front of her repaired blue dress, and she walked toward the door with her chin level and her spine straight. She did not look at Nathaniel Whitmore as she passed him, but she felt his eyes follow her. She was almost to the front door, almost out, almost free, almost past the ornate mirrors and the hovering footmen and the wall of perfumed air that pressed down on her chest when she heard footsteps behind her. Not hurrying, not tentative, just steady, purposeful. She turned. Nathaniel Whitmore was standing 4 feet away. He was not smiling, but the closed, distant expression he had worn all evening had shifted just slightly into something that she could not categorize, something watchful and serious and direct. He held something out to her, a small handkerchief. White linen initialed NW in the corner, pressed and folded. "Your cuff," he said. She looked down. There was a small splash of wine on her left cuff, not much, barely visible, but there. She looked back up at him. "I thought you said it was nothing," she said. Her voice was even. "You redirected the glass." "Not all of it," he said. "A beat." She took the handkerchief. "Thank you, Mr. Whitmore." He nodded once. And then, as if it cost him something to say, as if the words were things he had carried a long distance and was only now setting down, he said, "You handled yourself well tonight." Elizabeth studied him. "It was a dinner," she said. "It was more than a dinner," he said. "And you know it." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she folded the handkerchief in her hands. "I've had practice," she said simply. Something moved in his face. Something that might in another man have been the beginning of a smile. He stepped back. "Good evening, Miss Carter," he said. "Good evening, Mr. Whitmore." She walked out the door. Into the warm summer night. Into the dark that smelled of honeysuckle and lantern smoke and the long road home, and she pressed the handkerchief between her fingers the entire way. She did not know walking home that night that she was carrying the first piece of something that would take an entire year to build. She did not know that Nathaniel Whitmore stood in the doorway of the Pembroke mansion for a full minute after she left, watching the lantern she carried move down the road until it disappeared around the bend. She did not know that Charlotte Pembroke, watching from the parlor window, turned away from the glass with an expression that was no longer quite so certain of itself. And she did not know that later, much later in the small hours of that same night, Nathaniel would sit at the desk in his study in the quiet house that had been too quiet for too long, and think about the woman in the blue dress, about the way she had set her fork down, about the steadiness in her voice when the whole room was waiting for her to flinch, about his own hand closing over hers, and the fact that he had not wanted to let go. What Elizabeth Carter did know, as she unlocked the door of her father's house and slipped inside into the familiar smell of ink and paper and cold coffee, was that something had happened tonight? She didn't have words for it yet. She didn't need them. Some things announce themselves before they can be named. She set the handkerchief on the table beside her candle and looked at it for a long moment. N.W. Then she blew out the light. And in the dark, she smiled. Just a little, just enough. 3 days passed. Elizabeth did not think about Nathaniel Whitmore. That was what she told herself anyway, every morning when she sat down at the composing table beside her father and arranged the type blocks for the next edition of the Richmond Courier. She told herself she was thinking about the harvest reports, about the letter from the State Assembly that needed transcribing, about the subscription list that had grown by 11 names in the past month, a fact that her father was quietly deeply proud of, though he expressed it only by making her a slightly better cup of coffee than usual. She was not thinking about a white linen handkerchief with the initials N.W. pressed into the corner. She was absolutely not thinking about the 2 seconds during which a man who supposedly touched no one had held her hand in front of 40 witnesses and had not let go immediately. She was not thinking about it. The handkerchief was in the top drawer of her dresser, under her mother's Bible. She had put it there so she would not have to look at it. She thought about it constantly. On the 4th morning, her father looked up from his coffee and said without any preamble at all, "Charlotte Pembroke came by yesterday while you were at the market." Elizabeth's hands stilled on the type block she was holding. What did she want? To place an advertisement. He paused. "And to ask rather casually whether you'd heard from Nathaniel Whitmore since the dinner." The type block made a small, precise sound as Elizabeth set it down. "And what did you tell her?" Her father looked at her over the rim of his cup. He had the kind of eyes that had spent 30 years reading people through the narrow window of a press room, and they did not miss much. "I told her I wasn't aware my daughter had any correspondence with Mr. Whitmore," he said. She seemed disappointed. "Good," Elizabeth said. "Eliza." He set his cup down. "What happened at that dinner?" "Nothing I couldn't handle." "That is not what I asked." She looked at her father, at the steady, patient concern in his face. And for a moment, she almost told him, almost described the moment, the glass, the hand, the 2 seconds that had lasted somehow much longer than 2 seconds. But something stopped her. Some instinct for protecting a thing she didn't fully understand yet. "Nathaniel Whitmore was kind," she said simply, "in a room full of people who weren't. That's all." Her father was quiet. Then he nodded slowly the way he did when he was filing something away for later. "That's all," he repeated. He picked up his coffee. He did not say anything else. But Elizabeth noticed he watched her more carefully for the rest of the morning. The letter arrived on the 5th day. It was not romantic. She would think about that later, how it was nothing like the letters she'd read in the novels her friend Margaret passed around in secret, nothing full of flowery declaration or breathless sentiment. It was brief. It was formal. It was written in a hand that was precise and unhurried, the hand of a man who thought before he committed to paper. Miss Carter, I am given to understand that the Richmond Ladies Charitable Society holds its summer gathering at the Morrison Hall on the 20th of this month. My family has long supported this organization. I intend to attend. I mention this only because I thought you might find the event of interest given the work your father's paper has done covering such initiatives. Yours respectfully, N. Whitmore. Elizabeth read it twice. Then she set it on the table. Then she picked it up and read it again. It was not an invitation. Technically, it was information neutrally delivered with no explicit request attached to it. A man like Nathaniel Whitmore would know exactly how to write a letter that could not be misread as pursuing something it was not pursuing. But he had written it. He had found out her address, the print shop's address, and he had written it and sent it, and now it was sitting on her table. She folded it carefully and put it in the same drawer as the handkerchief. Then she told her father she would be attending the Charitable Society's summer gathering on the 20th. He didn't ask why. He just said, "I'll press your green dress." She had been going to wear the blue one again. She wore the green. Morrison Hall was cooler than the Pembroke Mansion, older, simpler, without the chandeliers and the imported wallpaper. The Charitable Society events drew a different crowd than Charlotte's dinners. Still the respectable families, still the names that Richmond traded on, but with a different texture, less performative, more purposeful. Women who actually cared about the organization's work, alongside women who came because it was expected, alongside a handful of men who attended out of obligation and sat near the windows looking like they'd rather be elsewhere. Nathaniel was one of those men. She saw him when she came in, standing near the far wall, slightly apart from the nearest cluster of guests, holding a cup of punch he clearly had not drunk any of. His posture was the same as it had been at the dinner, contained, closed, present in body, while seemingly absent in spirit. He saw her at the same moment she saw him. Neither of them moved toward the other, but something shifted in his expression, barely visible. A slight release of tension around his eyes, the way a man looks when he has been waiting for something to arrive and is trying not to show that he was waiting. Elizabeth turned to greet the woman nearest to her, a Mrs. Oakes who ran the Society's literacy program, and who was genuinely glad to see her, having corresponded with the Courier several times about coverage of the program's progress. For the next 20 minutes, she talked with Mrs. Oakes and two other women about the Society's work. She was aware of Nathaniel Whitmore across the room the entire time. It was Margaret Hale who forced the matter, as Margaret almost always did. Margaret was Elizabeth's oldest friend, the daughter of a clockmaker, bright and irreverent, and constitutionally incapable of pretending not to notice things. She appeared at Elizabeth's elbow somewhere around the 30-minute mark, pressed a fresh cup of punch into her hand, and said, in a voice pitched just below carrying distance, "He has looked at you 4 times in the last 10 minutes, and you are the only person in this room who has not noticed." "I noticed," Elizabeth said. "Then why are you over here talking about literacy programs?" "Because I care about literacy programs." "Elizabeth Carter," Margaret said with great feeling, "if that man came across an entire room to almost invite you to this event, the least you can do is walk 15 feet to say good afternoon." "He did not come across a room. He wrote a letter." "Which he had to find your address to send," Margaret said. "Do you understand how many steps that required for a man who reportedly does not take steps toward anyone?" Elizabeth looked at her. Margaret looked back with the expression of someone who had known her for 20 years and was entirely out of patience. Elizabeth took a sip of punch. Then she walked across the room. Nathaniel straightened slightly when she approached. It was subtle, the kind of adjustment a person makes without fully deciding to make it. "Mr. Whitmore," she said. Miss Carter. A pause. You came. Your letter suggested I might find it of interest. The corner of his mouth moved. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was the closest thing she had seen on his face. It did. She stood beside him rather than in front of him, shoulder to the same wall, looking out at the same room. It was easier somehow, less like a confrontation. You don't enjoy these events, she said. No, but you attend them. My family has supported the society for 15 years, he said. My mother attended every gathering until she passed. It seemed appropriate to continue. Elizabeth nodded. She understood that kind of obligation. The continuation of something after the person who started it was gone. My mother used to bring me to the literacy program here when I was small, she said, before I could read. She believed I would learn faster if I was surrounded by people who thought it mattered. Did it work? I was reading broadsheets at 5, she said. So I suppose it did. He looked at her then. Really looked at her the way he had looked at her in the Pembroke foyer, direct, without the practiced distance. You are not what they say you are, he said. It was so blunt that she almost laughed. She caught it, held it, turned it into something steadier. What do they say I am? She asked. He hesitated for just a moment. Ambitious, calculating, trying to position herself above her station. And what do you think I am? He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Brave, he said finally, in a way that most people in this room would not understand because they have never had to be. The word landed quietly, without flourish. It landed the way real things land, not with a bang, but with a weight that settled. That is the kindest thing anyone has said to me at one of these gatherings, Elizabeth said. Then the gatherings have been poorly managed, he said. This time she did laugh. Just a little. And the sound surprised them both. She thought surprised her because it came out more genuinely than she'd intended, and surprised him because he looked at her with an expression that was briefly, unmistakably unguarded. Then it closed again, but slower than before. He looked away, back at the room. His jaw tightened. I should tell you, he said, in a different register, lower, more careful, that coming here today was not conventional. I know, she said. People will talk. People talked when you held my hand at dinner, and you hadn't even spoken to me yet, she said plainly. I think we may be past the point of managing impressions, Mr. Whitmore. He looked at her sharply. She held his gaze, and something shifted. Some piece of whatever wall he carried around himself. It didn't fall, nothing so dramatic as that. But a crack appeared in it. She could see it clear as daylight. Miss Carter, he said after a pause that felt like it held more in it than a pause should be able to hold, would you permit me to call on your father? The room continued around them. Women moved between the tables. The string quartet in the corner began a soft piece. Margaret from across the room was watching with an expression that would require an entire retelling to satisfy later. I would not object to that, Elizabeth said. He nodded once. She nodded once, and that was all. But walking home that evening, this time with Margaret beside her, who talked for 3 solid blocks without taking a visible breath, Elizabeth pressed her hand against her sternum and felt something there that she hadn't felt in a long time. Something warm, something careful, something that might, if she was not very cautious with it, become something she could not afford to lose. She had been careful with herself for a long time. She had learned to be. When you grew up with a name that carried no weight, and a dress that had been mended twice, and a father who worked with his hands and his words instead of his land or his lineage, you learned early that hope was a thing you measured out in small amounts. You learned not to spend it all on one person. But there it was. Warm, careful, real. She decided not to talk herself out of it yet. Just for now. Just for tonight. She would be sensible in the morning. Nathaniel called on her father 4 days later. He arrived at the print shop at 10 in the morning, Not at the house, not at any of the social locations where such a call might be witnessed and processed by exactly the wrong people. He came to the shop. In his working clothes, or what passed for them, a dark coat, no cravat, the kind of clothes a man wore when he was trying not to be performing. Her father met him at the door. Elizabeth, who had been setting type at the back of the shop, heard their voices and made herself stay exactly where she was. She could not hear what was said, not clearly, not through the sound of the press and the street noise beyond the front window, but she heard the cadence of it, measured, unhurried. Two men talking in the register that men used when they were speaking plainly to each other. It lasted 40 minutes. Then she heard the bell above the door. Then her father appeared in the doorway of the back room. He looked at her for a moment. "He asked my permission to speak with you," he said. Elizabeth set down the type block she was holding. "And what did you tell him?" "I told him that my daughter makes her own choices," her father said. "And that if he was interested in speaking with you, he ought to consider whether he had anything worth saying." "Papa?" He said that was fair. Her father leaned against the doorframe. His expression was complicated, not worried exactly, but the face of a man holding two things at once. "He also said something that I have been thinking about since." "What?" "He said he wasn't certain he had any business calling on you. Given circumstances, he did not detail." Her father paused. "He said he came anyway because he thought you deserved to know that someone had noticed you." The print shop was very quiet. "He said that," Elizabeth said. "He did." Her father pushed off the doorframe. "He also left something at the counter." She walked to the front of the shop. On the counter beside the order ledger was a book, worn at the spine. No note, no card attached. She picked it up and looked at the cover. The Federalist Papers. She opened the front cover. There was a single sentence written on the inside page in the same precise, unhurried hand she recognized from the letter. For the woman who knows her own worth, regardless of what the room decides. Elizabeth stood there for a long time. Then she closed the book and held it. She would see him twice more over the following 2 weeks. Once at a town meeting she attended to take notes for the paper, where he arrived late and sat 3 rows behind her and said nothing to her directly, but caught her eye once when the assembly speaker said something particularly pompous, and she saw his expression shift into that almost smile she was beginning to recognize as a language all its own. Once at the dry goods store where they passed each other near the doorway, and he stepped aside to let her pass and said very quietly, "Good afternoon, Miss Carter." And she said, "Good afternoon, Mr. Whitmore." And they both continued on their way, and that was all it was, and somehow it was enough. Margaret, who had appointed herself the official chronicler of this development, said, "For 2 people who have barely spoken, you are communicating constantly." "Don't be dramatic," Elizabeth said. "I am not being dramatic. I am being observant. There is a difference." Then came the evening when everything shifted again. It was the 3rd week of August. The heat had not broken. Elizabeth had stayed late at the shop, finishing a compositor's error in the morning's run, and by the time she locked up and started home, the sun was low and orange and the streets had gone quiet. She was halfway down the block when she heard footsteps. Not threatening, she knew this street knew its sounds. But she turned on instinct. Nathaniel Whitmore was behind her. He was carrying his hat in his hands rather than on his head, which gave him a quality she had not seen before, something less armored. He looked for a moment simply like a man who had been walking and had something to say. "I was coming to the shop," he said. "I saw the light was out." "It's late," she said. "Yes." He didn't move closer. He stood at a comfortable distance with the hat turning slowly in his hands. "I wanted to—" He stopped, tried again. "There is something I have not explained, about the dinner, about the reason I—" Another stop, shorter this time. Elizabeth watched him struggle with it. She did not help him. She had learned that sometimes people needed to find their way to a thing without assistance. Helping too quickly meant they arrived at the words without having truly meant them. He looked up at her. "My brother died 6 years ago," he said. "In the James River. He fell from the bank. I went in after him." His voice was even, controlled. The control of someone who had said this before to a doctor, to a lawyer, to the authorities, to everyone except the person it had cost the most. I could not reach him. Elizabeth did not move. They told me I did everything that could be done, he continued. The current was, it didn't matter. I knew it didn't matter in the way you know things in your head. He paused. But my hands were the last things that reached for him, and they came back empty. The street was very quiet. Since then, he said, I have not found it easy to reach toward anyone. She understood then. The wall, the distance, the way he occupied rooms without truly entering them. It was not coldness. It was not indifference. It was a man who had decided somewhere in the grief of losing his brother that his hands were things that caused loss rather than prevented it. And at Charlotte Pembroke's dinner table, in front of 40 witnesses, he had reached for her anyway. Nathaniel, she said. It was the first time she had used his given name. She hadn't planned to. It simply came out because the moment called for it, and the moment was bigger than convention. He looked at her. Your hands caught that glass, she said. They steadied that tray. They kept that wine from ruining. She stopped, took a breath. Whatever story you have been telling yourself about what your hands mean, it is not the story I saw at that table. The story I saw was a man who moved towards someone when everyone else in that room was waiting for her to be humiliated. He said nothing. You did not take something away that night, she said. You protected something. She watched it move through him. Not dramatically. He was not a man for drama. But the way a tide shifts deep and slow and undeniable beneath the surface. Something released in his face that she thought might have been held there for 6 years. Miss Carter, he said after a long moment. Elizabeth, she said. He looked at her for a beat. Elizabeth, he said. The word came out different in his voice than she had expected. Careful, like something he was learning to hold. You are allowed to reach for things, she said, even after you've lost something, especially then. He looked down at the hat in his hands. He was quiet for so long that the night sounds of the street filled in around them, crickets somewhere, and the far-off sound of a door closing down the block. Then he said, I have been alone for a very long time. I know, she said. I am not. He stopped, steadied. I do not know that I am capable of the kind of warmth that people expect. I am not asking you for warmth, Elizabeth said. I am asking you for honesty. He raised his eyes to her face. Honesty, he repeated. Yes. Another pause, longer. I can do that, he said. She nodded. He put his hat back on, straightened the brim. It's late, he said. May I walk you home? Yes, she said, and they walked, not talking much, not needing to. The silence between them was different from the silence he had kept at the dinner table, not a wall, but a bridge, the kind of quiet that two people build together without quite realizing they're building it. When they reached her father's house, he stopped at the gate. Thank you, he said. For what? He thought about it. For not making it smaller than it was, he said. She understood what he meant. For not telling him it wasn't so bad, or that time healed all things, or any of the comfortable emptying phrases people offered grief to make themselves feel useful. For letting the weight of it be exactly what it weighed. Good night, Nathaniel, she said. Good night, Elizabeth. She went inside. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time in the dark, her hands folded in front of her, not quite thinking, just feeling the shape of the evening. The way things had moved between them. The way his voice had carried his brother's name in the silence between the words he had spoken. She thought about grief, about how it changed the way a person moved through the world, about how some people let it make them smaller, and some people let it make them harder, and some people rare. Careful, quiet people managed somehow to let it make them more honest. She thought Nathaniel Whitmore might be one of those people. She hoped she was too. She sat there until the candle burned down, and then she went to bed, and for the first time in as long as she could clearly remember, she did not think about the mended cuffs, or the room that had watched her, or Charlotte Pembroke's blade-edged smile. She thought about a man standing in a quiet street with his hat in his hands, searching for words, as if words were worth the effort of finding the right ones. And she slept better than she had in months. But Richmond was a small town with long eyes. Charlotte Pembroke saw them walking together that night. She was returning from a card party 2 streets over in a covered carriage with curtains that she did not entirely close because Charlotte Pembroke had never in her life failed to watch the people around her. She saw Elizabeth Carter walking beside Nathaniel Whitmore. She saw the way he walked, not ahead of Elizabeth, not behind her, but beside her. Equal. Deliberate. Charlotte leaned back in her carriage. Her expression in the moving shadow of the lantern light was something that had moved past surprise and settled into something colder and more purposeful. She had intended the dinner to embarrass Elizabeth Carter, to give her one costly public taste of the distance between her world and theirs. And instead, she had handed Nathaniel Whitmore a reason to notice a woman he might never have looked at twice. She tapped the window frame with one gloved finger. Once. Twice. Her mind was already working. She did not move against a thing immediately. Charlotte had never been impulsive. Impulsive was for women who hadn't learned that patience was the sharpest instrument in the room. She would wait. She would watch. And when the moment was right, when Nathaniel's family was paying attention, when society's eye was at its clearest, when Elizabeth Carter had allowed herself to believe in something, she would remind everyone exactly who Elizabeth Carter was, and exactly who she was not. Charlotte Pembroke was a woman who understood timing the way a surgeon understood a blade. She did not move the morning after she saw them walking together. She did not move the day after that. She let a full week pass, a week during which Elizabeth went about her work at the print shop, during which Nathaniel attended to his estate business, during which the two of them saw each other exactly twice briefly in the kind of ordinary public moments that meant nothing to anyone watching and everything to the two people living them. Charlotte let that week pass, and then on a Tuesday morning the story appeared, not in the Richmond Courier. Her father would never have run it, and Charlotte knew better than to approach a man who had nothing to lose and 30 years of journalistic integrity protecting him. No, it appeared in the kind of way that stories in Richmond always appeared when someone with money and motive wanted them circulated as conversation. As whisper. As the specific kind of remark that gets made at 3 separate breakfast tables on the same morning in slightly different words by women who had all spoken to the same person the evening before. I hear Elizabeth Carter has been calling on Nathaniel Whitmore, alone, in the evenings. They say she's been positioning herself since the Pembroke dinner. Very calculated, apparently. Someone ought to warn him. She's charming enough, I suppose, but the family, well. The word calculated was Charlotte's particular genius. It was a word that could not be argued with directly without sounding defensive. It transformed everything Elizabeth had done, the dinner, the charity event, the walk home, into evidence of a plan, a scheme. It reframed a woman being noticed for her dignity into a woman engineering her own advancement. Elizabeth heard the first version of it from Margaret, who arrived at the print shop on Wednesday morning with her jaw set and her eyes carrying the particular expression of a friend about to deliver news she wished she didn't have. "You need to know," Margaret said without preamble, "that Charlotte Pembroke has been very busy." Elizabeth listened. She did not interrupt. She set down the galley proof she'd been correcting, and she listened while Margaret told her everything she'd heard the breakfast tables, the specific words, the careful surgical precision of the campaign being run against her. When Margaret finished, the shop was quiet for a moment. Then Elizabeth picked the galley proof back up. "All right," she said. Margaret stared at her. "All right. That's all you have to say." "What would you like me to say?" "Something more than all right, Elizabeth." "She's doing what she planned to do from the beginning," Elizabeth said. Her voice was level. Her hands were not entirely steady. Margaret would have noticed that because Margaret noticed everything, but her voice was level. "I knew when I walked into that dinner that there was a cost to walking in. I walked in anyway." "The cost has gotten considerably higher," Margaret said. "If this reaches Nathaniel's family—" "It already has," Elizabeth said. Margaret went still. Elizabeth looked at her. A letter arrived at the shop this morning. From Nathaniel. She reached into her apron pocket and set it on the composing table. He says his aunt has written to him. His cousin has called. His family's man of business has raised concerns about— She paused, choosing the word carefully. The suitability of his current social associations. Margaret picked up the letter. She read it. What does he say he's going to do? She asked. He hasn't said yet, Elizabeth said. He's asked to meet me this afternoon. The words sat between them. And you, Margaret said quietly. What are you going to do? Elizabeth looked at the galley proof in her hands, at the neat rows of type, at the words that her father had spent 30 years believing were worth the effort of printing and distributing to people who sometimes burned them in their fireplaces and sometimes passed them to neighbors who needed to know what was true. I'm going to go meet him, she said, and I'm going to listen to what he says. She paused. And then I will decide. They met at Morrison Hall, which was empty on a weekday afternoon, a neutral space public enough to be proper, quiet enough to speak plainly. Elizabeth arrived first. She sat in one of the straight-backed chairs near the window and folded her hands in her lap and breathed. She heard his footsteps before she saw him. She recognized them already, that measured, purposeful pace that didn't hurry and didn't drag, that said, I am going somewhere, and I have decided to go there without announcing it. He came through the door and stopped when he saw her. His face was tighter than she had seen it. Not the practiced distance of the dinner, something more honest than that. The face of a man carrying weight he wasn't sure how to set down. He sat across from her. You've heard, he said. Yes. I want you to know, I did not come here to make excuses for my family, he said, or to manage this on their behalf. Then why did you come? He looked at her directly. Because I owe you honesty. You asked me for it specifically. And honesty means telling you that my family has made their position clear and that the position is going to create difficulty. Tell me exactly what they said, Elizabeth said. He was quiet for a moment, gathering the words. My aunt wrote that she had heard her exact phrase was disturbing reports about my spending time with a young woman of inappropriate standing. She used those two words, inappropriate standing. Something moved across his face. Controlled anger. My cousin called the day after and said that if I were to pursue any formal connection with someone outside our circle, it would reflect on the family's position at a time when our finances are already— He stopped. Elizabeth watched him. Already what? She said. His jaw worked. Already fragile, he said. The word fell between them like a stone. Fragile. Elizabeth had not known that. No one in Richmond knew that, or if they suspected they hadn't confirmed it, and they certainly hadn't spoken it aloud, because the Whitmore name was one of those names that held its value partly through the assumption that its value was unquestioned. She understood then several things at once. She understood why Charlotte's campaign was particularly dangerous. It was not just about Elizabeth's reputation. It was about Nathaniel's family needing him to make an advantageous match, to bring money or land or name into the Whitmore estate at a moment when the estate needed all three. And Elizabeth Carter, daughter of a newspaperman with her mended cuffs and her father's ink-stained hands, she brought none of those things. She understood why his cousin had called, why his aunt had written. She understood in the cold, clear way that she had always understood the world, practically honestly. Without the softening, she could not afford exactly what she was to the Whitmore family's calculations. A liability. I see, she said. Elizabeth. No. She kept her voice even. I'm not angry. I just want to understand completely. She looked at him. Your family believes that associating with me harms your position. They believe that your position is currently vulnerable, and they are correct on both counts. They are not correct on Nathaniel. She used his name the way she had on the street that night, not to soften, but to make him stop and hear her. Your family's finances are real. That's not opinion. And whatever Charlotte has put into circulation about me is making its rounds through every parlor in Richmond as we speak. Those are facts. He was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen before, something between frustration and grief. "I don't care about any of that," he said. "I know you don't," she said. "That is part of the problem." He blinked. "If you didn't care because it didn't matter, that would be one thing," she said carefully. "But it does matter. It matters to the people who depend on your estate, your tenants, your household, the men who work your land." She paused. "Your brother's memory, what you've kept going in his name." The last words were a risk. She knew it when she said them. They landed visibly. She saw it move through him, saw the way his breath changed. "That's not fair," he said. "No," she agreed. "It isn't." They were quiet. Outside the hall, a cart moved past on the road. Someone called to someone else. The ordinary sounds of an ordinary afternoon, indifferent to the weight of what was happening in the room. "What are you saying to me?" Nathaniel asked. His voice had dropped. It was the voice she'd heard on the street, the one underneath the controlled exterior. Real. Unguarded. "I'm saying I won't be the reason you lose what you've been holding together," Elizabeth said. "I'm saying that if stepping back from whatever this is the right thing for the people who depend on you, then I will not stand in the way of that." He stood up. It happened quickly enough that she startled slightly. He pushed back his chair, and he stood, and he walked to the window, not looking out, it just putting distance between himself and the conversation, which she understood, because she did the same thing when words were coming at her, faster than she could sort them. "You are the most frustrating woman I have ever met," he said. She raised an eyebrow. "Because I'm being reasonable. Because you keep offering to leave for my sake. And you are the only person in the past 6 years who has made me want to stay." He turned to face her. "Do you understand what I'm telling you?" She looked at him. He crossed back to the table. He sat down. He put his hands flat on the surface between them. Both. Hands open, deliberate, the gesture of a man offering something he'd kept closed for a long time. "I have been disappearing," he said, "for 6 years, since Thomas died. I have been present in body, and absent in every other sense, and I have told myself this was the right way to live, because it meant I could not lose anything else." He looked at his hands. "You walked into a room where everyone was waiting to see you break, and you didn't break. And something in me that had been deciding not to notice anything it noticed." Elizabeth was very still. "I am not asking you to stay for my sake," he said. "I am telling you that my family's pressure, and Charlotte Pembroke's whispers, and the whole social machinery of this town working against us, none of it changes what I know. Which is that you are worth more than any of this. And I am done disappearing." The hall was very quiet. Elizabeth looked at his hands flat on the table between them. "That is the most words I have heard you say at once," she said. Something broke open in his face. The almost smile, but more than that this time. Real. Fully arrived. "Don't tell anyone," he said. "I have a reputation to maintain." She laughed. The real kind, the unguarded kind, and it startled them both a little, and neither of them tried to stop it. Then it settled, and they were quiet, and the weight of everything Charlotte Pembroke was doing came back into the room where it lived. "She's not finished," Elizabeth said. "I know. Your family will push harder before they stop. I know that too. And you're still sitting here." He looked at her. "I'm still sitting here," he said. She nodded, slowly. She looked down at the table at the space between their hands that was smaller than it had been when they sat down. "Then we need to think," she said. "Practically. About what comes next." "Yes," he said. "Together," she said. It was not a question exactly, but she waited for his answer anyway. "Together," he said. And in the quiet hall on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in August, with Charlotte Pembroke's campaign running through every parlor in Richmond, and Nathaniel's family writing letters, and the whole weight of a society designed to keep people in their assigned places pressing down on both of them, they sat across from each other and began to plan. It was, Elizabeth would think later, the most intimate thing they had done. More intimate than the hand at the dinner table. More intimate than the walk home. More intimate than all the careful charged moments in between. Because this was not feeling. This was choosing. Deliberately. Eyes open. That mattered. That mattered enormously. The first public confrontation came 10 days later. It happened at the autumn social preview and early season gathering hosted by the Morrison family, traditional and well-attended, the kind of event that the whole of Richmond's upper circle treated as a dress rehearsal for the more formal events to come. Elizabeth had not planned to go. It was strictly speaking above the tier of events she was usually included in. But Mrs. Morrison, an older woman, sharp and fair-minded, who had been friends with Elizabeth's mother and had quietly despised Charlotte Pembroke for 20 years, sent her an invitation directly. Elizabeth suspected Mrs. Morrison knew exactly what she was doing. She went. Margaret came with her, which meant she had at least one person beside her who would tell her the truth, no matter what happened. They had been there less than 30 minutes when Charlotte made her move. It was elegant in its way. Charlotte did not approach Elizabeth directly. She positioned herself near a cluster of women that Elizabeth happened to be moving toward. Women Elizabeth knew, slightly women who were not her friends, but not her enemies either. The neutral territory of Richmond society. Charlotte let the conversation reach a natural pause. And then she said clearly, warmly, as though she were simply continuing a thought, "Of course one always sympathizes with ambition. It's the method that raises questions." The women near her went still. Elizabeth was 3 feet away. She had heard it. Charlotte turned as if noticing her arrival with a smile of perfect theatrical surprise. "Oh, Miss Carter, we were just speaking of—" She paused, just the right length of pause. "The upcoming charity drive. You must be covering it for your father's paper." The implication sat in the air like smoke. Your father's paper. Not the paper, not even the courier. Your father's. As if Elizabeth were an extension of her father's property, rather than a person in her own right. As if her presence at any gathering above the newspaper office were a category error. The women in the group looked between them. Elizabeth felt the familiar weight of a room deciding what she was. She had felt it before. She understood feel it again. The question was never whether it came. The question was what you did when it arrived. She looked at Charlotte. "Mrs. Morrison's charity drive," she said pleasantly. "Yes, my father's paper has covered it for 6 years. It's one of our most read series each season." She paused. "Though I'm attending this evening as a guest, not a journalist. Mrs. Morrison was kind enough to include me." One of the women, Mrs. Haverford, from the dinner, the one who had spoken with Elizabeth, genuinely said, "Of course. She's very fond of you, Miss Carter. She speaks of your mother often." It was a small thing, but it landed. Charlotte's smile remained. Her eyes did not. "How lovely," she said. "Family connections are such a comfort." The weight she placed on the word family was surgical. "Though I do sometimes wonder whether we serve people best by including them in circles where well." She lifted her hand slightly, vague, generous seeming. "Where the expectations may be difficult to meet." The air in the group went very still. This was the move. This was Charlotte's actual move. Not the word calculated, not the whisper campaign, but this. The public witnessed statement that reframed charity as condescension, and Elizabeth's presence as a form of cruelty being done to Elizabeth herself. We are not excluding her. We are protecting her from a world she cannot navigate. It was masterful. Elizabeth could acknowledge that, even as she felt the sting of it. She was opening her mouth. She had a response. She had 3 responses. She'd had 2 weeks to think about this exact moment when she felt it. A presence. Not dramatic. Not announced. Simply there. The way a wall is there, solid, quiet, unambiguous. Nathaniel Whitmore had walked across the room. Not hurried, not performing. He simply walked across the room and came to stand beside Elizabeth, and in doing so, he altered the entire geometry of the group. Because now Charlotte was not standing above a woman she'd been slowly dismantling in front of witnesses. She was standing across from a man who had made a choice by where he put his feet and the choice was visible to every person in the circle. He did not say anything immediately. He looked at Charlotte. Charlotte looked at him. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, and her voice had changed, still controlled, but recalibrated. "We were just—" "I heard," he said. 2 words. He reached down and took Elizabeth's hand. Not secretly, not reflexively the way he had at the dinner. This was deliberate. This was a man who had thought about what he was doing and done it with his eyes open and his back straight. He held her hand in full view of every person in that group of the people standing nearest of the half-dozen faces that had turned at the shift in energy across the room. Charlotte's face did something that she couldn't entirely control. For just a moment, one breath, one blink, her composure cracked, and something raw and furious showed through. Then it was gone, smoothed back into the performance. But the women in the group had seen it. "She is the only person I have met in 3 years of attending these gatherings," Nathaniel said with the flat certainty of a man reading something that was written down somewhere and simply reporting what it said, "who treated me like a man instead of a name. I would appreciate it if the same courtesy were extended to her." Charlotte recovered herself. She smiled. "Of course. None of us meant any—" "I know what was meant," Nathaniel said. Another silence. Then Mrs. Haverford, in the way of a woman who had been waiting for an opening, said comfortably, "Miss Carter, I have been meaning to ask you, has your father given any thought to expanding the Courier's coverage of the eastern parishes? My sister-in-law has been hoping for more local news from that direction." And just like that, with the practiced grace of an older woman who knew exactly how to redirect a room, the group moved on. Charlotte excused herself 2 minutes later. Elizabeth watched her go. Nathaniel beside her had not released her hand. She looked at him. He looked at her. "You didn't have to do that," she said. Low. "Just for him." "I know," he said. "Your family will hear about this before morning." "They were going to hear something eventually," he said. "I would rather it be the truth." She looked at him for a moment. At the set of his jaw, and the steadiness in his eyes, and the way his hand, the hand he had not trusted for 6 years, was holding hers without hesitation. "You are going to make your life very complicated," she said. "My life was very simple," he said. "Simple and entirely empty. I prefer complicated." She squeezed his hand. Just once. He squeezed back. It was the most they had ever said without speaking. The letter from Nathaniel's aunt arrived at the Whitmore estate 2 days later. Elizabeth did not see it. She heard about its contents from Nathaniel, who came to the print shop the following morning and stood at the counter with his hat in his hands, in the way she was coming to recognize as his version of needing to say something difficult. He told her everything. His aunt had written in her most formal register, the one she reserved for matters of genuine seriousness, to say that his behavior at the Morrison gathering had been witnessed and reported to her in full detail, and that she was deeply concerned about the direction of his judgment. She had included, Nathaniel said, a list of 3 names. Young women from appropriate families. 2 of them had significant dowries. 1 of them had land adjacent to the Whitmore estate. His aunt had also written at the bottom of the letter, in a postscript that Nathaniel recited to Elizabeth from memory, "I know you have been grieving Thomas in your own way, and I have been patient. But grief cannot be allowed to become an excuse for throwing away what your family has built. You owe the living as much as you owe the dead." Elizabeth heard this without speaking. Then she said, "She loves you." Nathaniel looked at her. "I'm not defending what she's doing," Elizabeth said. "But that letter was written by a woman who is frightened. For you and for the family." She paused. "People who don't care don't bother with 3 names and property maps. They just let you go." He was quiet for a moment. "You are defending her." "I am understanding her," Elizabeth said. "Those are different things." She leaned on the counter. "What did you write back?" "I haven't yet." "What are you going to say?" He looked at her for a long time. "I am going to tell her that I hear her concern, and I will address the financial matters as soon as I am able. And I am going to tell her that my personal choices are my own." "And if she comes to Richmond?" Something flickered across his face. "She will," he said. Elizabeth absorbed this. When? Her letter was dated 4 days ago. She drives fast. He paused. Probably within the week. Elizabeth nodded slowly. All right, she said. You are doing the thing again, Nathaniel said. What thing? The thing where you say all right when you mean something considerably more complicated. She looked at him. He was watching her with an expression that was entirely different from the face he'd worn at Charlotte's dinner. Not closed, not distant, but present. Reading her. The way you only read someone when you have decided they are worth the effort. It was still startling sometimes. Being seen. I'm thinking, she said, about the fact that your aunt is right about one thing, she said. The financial difficulty is real, and I have been trying to think of whether there is anything practical I can do about it. He shook his head. Elizabeth, I would not ask you to. You didn't ask, she said. I'm offering, or I'm thinking about offering. I haven't worked it out yet. She straightened up. My father has connections throughout the eastern counties. Merchants, landowners, local officials who read the Courier and trust it. Your estate, what does it produce primarily? He blinked. The shift from the personal to the practical had clearly not been what he expected. Tobacco primarily, he said. Some timber. The western quarter has been underused for 3 seasons. Because of the markets, or because of management? Both, he said slowly. After Thomas, I was not attentive to the business side for some time. By the time I was, several of our trading relationships had shifted. Then they can be rebuilt, she said. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't entirely name. Something between confusion and something much warmer. You are talking about my estate's commerce, he said. Yes. At 8 o'clock on a Wednesday morning. Is that a problem? He was quiet for a moment. No, he said. It is the most useful conversation I have had about the estate in 2 years. He paused. Possibly longer. Then stop looking at me like I've grown a second head and tell me who your current buyers are, he told her. They spent 45 minutes at the print shop counter with Elizabeth asking questions and Nathaniel answering them, and her father appearing in the doorway of the back room. At one point taking in the scene his daughter with a quill and paper, Nathaniel Whitmore listing trade contacts with the focused expression of a man who had not talked this practically about his own problems in years, and then retreating without a word, though Elizabeth heard him humming quietly to himself as he went. Nathaniel's aunt, Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore, arrived in Richmond on a Saturday afternoon. Elizabeth knew the moment she arrived because Margaret sent a note to the print shop within 20 minutes of the carriage being spotted on the main road. Margaret's information network operated with a speed and accuracy that put most official communications to shame. The note said simply, "She's here. She went directly to the estate. He's been warned. Hold steady." Elizabeth folded the note, put it in her pocket, went back to work. She heard nothing from Nathaniel until Sunday evening, when a letter arrived brief, very controlled the precision of a man choosing each word carefully. My aunt has made her views known at length. The conversation was significant. She would like to meet you. Elizabeth read it twice. Then she sat down. This was not a friendly invitation. This was not Mrs. Morrison extending a warm hand. Eleanor Whitmore wanted to meet Elizabeth Carter the way you wanted to examine a thing that had attached itself to something you were responsible for protecting. She was being assessed. She wrote back in the same register, brief, controlled. I am available Tuesday morning at 10. The courier office would be most convenient for me if that is acceptable. She chose the print shop deliberately. Not a neutral location, not a tea room or a hall. The print shop, her territory. Her father's life's work on the walls, ink and paper and 30 years of choosing to say true things in a world that preferred comfortable ones. If Eleanor Whitmore wanted to understand who Elizabeth Carter was, she could come and see. Eleanor Whitmore arrived at 9:55 on Tuesday morning, which told Elizabeth several things immediately: that she was precise, that she was not going to cede even 5 minutes of advantage by arriving late, and that she had been thinking about this meeting at least as much as Elizabeth had. She was 60 perhaps, with iron gray hair and Nathaniel's eyes, that same directness, that same quality of looking at something and seeing it plainly. She wore traveling clothes still, as if she had not troubled to change, which was, itself a statement, "I am not here to impress you." Elizabeth met her at the door. They looked at each other for a moment. "Miss Carter," Eleanor said. "Mrs. Whitmore," Elizabeth said. "Please come in." Her father had made himself scarce. He was in the back of the shop, deliberately audible with occasional sounds of work present but not hovering. It was exactly the right amount of distance, and Elizabeth was grateful for it. She brought Eleanor to the small table near the front window where she and her father took their morning coffee. She poured 2 cups without asking. Eleanor took hers without commenting. "I will not waste your time with pleasantries," Eleanor said. "I appreciate that," Elizabeth said. "I am going to speak plainly about my concerns. I would ask you to do the same." "That's all I know how to do," Elizabeth said. Eleanor studied her. Something shifted slightly in her expression. Not warmth, not yet, but a recalibration. The acknowledgement of something unexpected. "My nephew," Eleanor said, "has not been well. Not since Thomas died. I do not mean physically. I mean—" She paused. "He has been present in the technical sense and absent in every meaningful sense. For 6 years. She set down her cup. "Whatever you have done or said or been in the past months, he is different. I can see it even in his letters, which he has never been generous with." Elizabeth said nothing. She waited. This would be cause for gratitude. Eleanor continued. "If the circumstances were different. If you were differently situated." She said it without cruelty, but without apology. A plain fact stated plainly. "You mean if I had money or land or a name that helped him instead of complicating him?" Elizabeth said. "Yes," Eleanor said. "I understand," Elizabeth said. "And I will not pretend those things don't matter, because they do. The estate's finances are real. The pressure on him is real." She paused. "But I want you to understand something." Eleanor waited. "I have not been trying to take anything from him," Elizabeth said. "I have been trying to give him something back, whatever I can." She looked at Eleanor directly. "The hand he used to hold mine at that dinner table, he told me what that hand meant to him, what it had meant since his brother died. Do you know he had not willingly reached for anyone in 6 years?" Eleanor's face moved, just barely, a tightening around the eyes. "I know," she said quietly. "I am not a solution to your family's financial problems," Elizabeth said. "I know that. I am not going to pretend otherwise, but I am also not a cause of them. And I am not willing to be treated as though the only value I could possibly offer is what I can bring in terms of land or dowry." She kept her voice even, not angry, certain. "Because that is not the only kind of value that exists. And you know that. Because you raised a man who understands it too." Eleanor was very still. The print shop breathed around them. The sound of the press in the back room. The smell of ink. The thin light through the front window falling across the table between them. Eleanor picked up her coffee cup. She did not speak for a long moment. "He said you were direct," she said finally. "He was accurate," Elizabeth said. "He also said—" Eleanor paused. "Set the cup down." "He said that you were the first person who had treated him like the loss of his brother was not a thing to be managed or minimized, that you had simply let it be what it was." Elizabeth felt the weight of that land in her chest. "It was what it was," she said simply. Eleanor looked at her for a long time. The assessment was visible, present, thorough, without pretense. Then she said, "My family has been struggling for 2 years. Nathaniel knows it. He has been trying to hold it together largely alone, which is part of why he has been so—" She searched for the word. "Contracted. The estate needs new trading relationships and better management of the Western Quarter, and someone who can speak to the right people without pride getting in the way." Elizabeth did not look away. "I have been thinking about the trading relationships," she said carefully. Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "My father's paper has connections throughout the eastern counties," Elizabeth said. "Merchants, landowners, officials. People who trust what they read in the Courier because we have never asked them to trust anything false." She kept her voice even. "I can't offer a dowry. I can offer a network. And I can offer someone who has spent her whole life understanding what it means to build something with words and honesty when you don't have anything else to build with." Eleanor looked at her. And then slowly, with the care of a woman who did not give things easily, she nodded. Not agreement exactly, not surrender. But the acknowledgement that Elizabeth Carter was something she had not fully expected to find sitting across from her in a newspaper office on a Tuesday morning. Something that deserved more consideration than she had walked in prepared to give. "I have concerns that remain," Eleanor said. "I know," Elizabeth said. "This conversation is not finished." "I know that too." Eleanor picked up her gloves. She smoothed them in her hands. She stood. "I would like to speak to your father," she said. Elizabeth stood as well. "He's in the back. I'll get him." She walked to the doorway. And as she did, she heard Eleanor Whitmore say behind her, almost to herself, "Nathaniel was right about one thing." Elizabeth paused, turned slightly. "What was that?" she asked. "He said you had more courage than anyone in that dining room," Eleanor said. "He was not wrong." Elizabeth looked at her for a moment. "It's easier to have courage," she said, "when you have nothing to lose but your dignity." Eleanor was quiet. Then, "Nathaniel has a great deal to lose." "I know," Elizabeth said, "which is why I will not let him lose it for the wrong reasons." She went to get her father, and in the front room of the Courier, Richmond, Virginia, in the burning summer of 1817, Eleanor Whitmore sat down in the chair she had just vacated and looked at the walls of the print shop at the ink and the broadsheets and the 30 years of honest work. And she thought with the careful, honest mind that Nathaniel had inherited from her side of the family that she might have come here expecting to end something. She was no longer certain, and Charlotte Pembroke, who had expected to win weeks ago, had not accounted for a woman who had never needed anything to fight with except the truth. That was her first mistake. It would not be her last. Eleanor Whitmore stayed in Richmond for 11 days. That was the first surprise. Elizabeth had expected 2, perhaps 3 enough time for the woman to make her assessment, deliver her verdict to Nathaniel, and return to whatever life she'd paused to come here and protect. But Eleanor stayed 11 days, and by the 3rd day, Elizabeth began to understand that the assessment was not finished. It was ongoing. Eleanor came back to the print shop on Thursday. Not announced, not with the formal gravity of the first visit. She simply appeared in the doorway at 9:30 in the morning, looked around as if taking an inventory, and said to Elizabeth's father, "Mr. Carter, I understand you've been covering the Eastern County trade situation for some years. I have questions." Her father, who had seen everything Richmond had to offer in 30 years of running a newspaper, and was surprised by very little, looked at Eleanor Whitmore for exactly 1 second. Then he said, "Sit down, Mrs. Whitmore. I'll get coffee." They talked for 2 hours. Elizabeth worked at the composing table and did not interrupt, but she listened. She heard Eleanor asking questions that were precise and well-informed, not the vague curiosity of a woman being polite, but the targeted questions of someone who understood commerce and was trying to understand it better. And she heard her father answering in the way he always answered when someone asked him something real directly with detail, without flattery. When Eleanor finally stood to leave, she paused near the door and looked at Elizabeth. "Your father is a remarkable man," she said. "I know," Elizabeth said. "It runs in the family apparently," Eleanor said. And she left. Elizabeth looked at her father. Her father was looking at the door with an expression she hadn't seen on his face in years. Something quiet and satisfied, like a man who has placed a seed in good ground and is choosing to trust the season. "She's going to come around," he said. "You don't know that," Elizabeth said. He picked up his coffee cup. "I've been reading people through this window for 30 years, Eliza. I know." The second surprise came from Nathaniel. He arrived at the shop on Friday evening after Eleanor had retired to the room she was staying in at the Morrison house. Mrs. Morrison, who had not forgiven Charlotte Pembroke for 20 years of slights, had extended the invitation with visible satisfaction, and he stood at the counter and said without introduction, "I need to show you something." He had a ledger under his arm. Not a small one. The kind of ledger that held years of accounts thick with pages and heavy with what those pages contained. He put it on the counter. "I want you to see the actual situation," he said. "Not what I've been managing to present publicly, not what my family has been telling themselves. The actual numbers." Elizabeth looked at the ledger, then at him. "Why?" she said. "Because you asked me for honesty," he said. "And because you have been trying to help me rebuild something without knowing the full extent of what needs rebuilding." He paused. "That isn't fair to you." She looked at his face, at the particular quality of courage it took for a man like Nathaniel Whitmore, a man whose entire identity was tied up in a family name, and the weight of what that name was supposed to guarantee to put a ledger showing financial fragility on a counter in front of a woman he was trying to impress. It was, she thought, one of the bravest things she had seen him do, including the hand at the dinner table. She opened the ledger. She read for a long time. Nathaniel was quiet, which was. She had learned one of his great qualities: the ability to be present without filling space unnecessarily. The situation was serious. Not catastrophic, not yet, but the margins were narrow and had been getting narrower for 3 years. 2 significant trade relationships had dissolved after Thomas's death when Nathaniel had been unable to give the estate his full attention. A bad harvest season 2 years ago had hit harder than it should have because the reserves were already thinner than they appeared, and there was a loan not large, but not small, that had been taken out against the western quarter of the estate and was coming due in 8 months. 8 months. Elizabeth turned the pages carefully. She was not a merchant's daughter. She was a newspaperman's daughter, but she had spent her whole life reading, understanding, translating information into something actionable. That was what the press did. That was what words did when used correctly. She could read this. She did read it. When she looked up, Nathaniel was watching her with an expression that was trying not to be anxious and not entirely succeeding. "The Western Quarter," she said. "You said it's been underused for 3 seasons." "Yes." "The loan against it. What were the original terms?" he told her. "And the creditor." He named a merchant in Fredericksburg. Elizabeth's father knew that man, had corresponded with him twice, had published a piece 2 years ago about his business that the man had written a letter of appreciation about. She did not say this yet. "The 2 trade relationships that dissolved," she said. "Do you know why they ended specifically? The Hargrove family moved their business north. The Kellner operation, Henry Kellner died, and his son took over, and the son had different priorities." "Is the son still operating?" Nathaniel looked at her. "I believe so. I have not been in contact." "The son would have inherited a network his father built," Elizabeth said. "A network his father built partly through the Courier's commercial announcements, if I'm not mistaken. My father would have records." She tapped the ledger. "There may be a way back in." Nathaniel was very still. "Elizabeth," he said. "I'm not promising anything," she said quickly. "I'm thinking out loud. These are possibilities, not guarantees." "That's not what I was going to say," he said. She looked at him. "I was going to say," he said carefully, "that I have sat with this ledger for 2 years, feeling like a man standing in front of a locked door with no key. And you have been looking at it for 20 minutes, and you are already trying the windows." She felt something catch in her chest. "The windows might be locked too," she said. "They might," he agreed. "But you're trying them." She looked at the ledger, then at him. "Together," she said. He reached across the counter and closed his hand over hers where it rested on the open page. "Together," he said. She did not pull away. Neither did he. They stood there for a moment in the print shop that smelled of ink and possibility, and 30 years of her father's honest work, and something settled between them that was quieter and steadier and more real than anything they had said in the charged moments before. This was not the drama of the dinner table or the heat of the Morrison Hall confrontation. This was 2 people looking at a hard thing and deciding to look at it together. This, Elizabeth thought, was what it actually meant to trust someone. The following morning she went to her father. She told him everything. about the ledger, about the loan, about the Kellner operation and the 8-month timeline. She put it all on the table between them the way Nathaniel had put the ledger on the shop counter, plainly without softening, because her father had spent his life believing that the truth deserved to be said in its actual shape. Her father listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You know what you're asking," he said. "I'm asking whether you would be willing to reach out to some of your contacts on the Whitmore estate's behalf," she said. "Yes." "That is not nothing," her father said. "That is the courier's reputation attached to a business recommendation." "I know," she said. "I wouldn't ask if I didn't believe it was warranted." Her father looked at her for a long time. "Eliza," he said, "I need to ask you something directly." "All right." "Are you doing this because you believe it's the right business move," he said, "or because you love him?" The word landed in the room between them. Neither of them had said it before. It had existed in the shape of things in the ledger and the handkerchief and the hand held in front of 40 witnesses, but no one had named it. Elizabeth did not look away from her father. "Both," she said. "And I don't think those two things have to be in conflict." Her father was quiet. "No," he said finally. "They don't." He picked up his coffee. "I'll write to James Kellner this week, and to 2 others I think might be receptive." He paused. "But Eliza, whatever comes of this business, make sure he understands it's not a payment. It's not you trying to earn your place. You understand?" She nodded. "It's what people do," her father said quietly, "when they've decided someone is worth the effort." She reached across the table and put her hand over his. He patted it once the way he always had since she was small. Solid. Certain. "Go to work," he said. She went to work. Charlotte Pembroke's final move came on a Wednesday. Elizabeth should have seen it coming. She told herself later that she had in some part of herself that the 2 weeks of relative quiet after Eleanor's arrival had felt too quiet the way the air feels before a storm when everything goes still and the birds stop. Charlotte was not a woman who stopped. She was a woman who waited. What Charlotte had been waiting for Elizabeth understood afterward was confirmation, and she had gotten it from somewhere through someone that the Whitmore estate was financially strained, that there was a loan on the Western Quarter, that Nathaniel's position was more vulnerable than Richmond's surface understanding of the Whitmore name suggested. Charlotte had been running a campaign against Elizabeth's character. Now she had a better weapon. She used it at the Pembroke family's autumn reception, an event that Eleanor Whitmore attended because the Pembroke and Whitmore families had maintained a decades-long social connection, and Eleanor was too careful to sever it publicly before she was ready. Nathaniel attended with her. Elizabeth was not there. It was not her world, had never been her world, but Margaret was, because Margaret had a gift for being in every room that mattered, without anyone quite noticing how she got there. Margaret sent a note to Elizabeth the following morning. Elizabeth read it standing at the composing table. Her hands went still. Margaret's note said Charlotte told Eleanor, directly privately cornered her near the south parlor, that Elizabeth Carter's father has been reaching out to trading contacts on the Whitmore estate's behalf. She framed it as Elizabeth orchestrating a financial rescue to make herself indispensable. She called it, Margaret had underlined this, a transaction disguised as affection. She said Elizabeth was buying her way into the family through the back door because she couldn't get through the front. Elizabeth set the note down. She stood very still. Then she picked up her coat. She walked directly to the Morrison house where Eleanor was staying. She knocked on the door herself. She asked to see Mrs. Whitmore. Eleanor appeared in the sitting room doorway, already dressed, already composed. She looked at Elizabeth's face, and she said nothing, just stepped aside and let her in. Elizabeth did not sit down. "You spoke with Charlotte Pembroke last night," she said. Eleanor looked at her steadily. "Yes." "She told you about the letters my father is writing to the trading contacts?" "Yes." "And she told you what she believes it means?" "Yes," Eleanor said. She was quite detailed. Elizabeth looked at her. "What did you say to her?" Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Something moved in her face, the same thing that had moved there when Elizabeth mentioned Thomas's name, that barely controlled response to something that cost her. I said. Eleanor replied carefully that I would consider what she had told me. The room went still. Elizabeth felt it land. The particular weight of not yet, of still undecided, of a woman who had come 17 steps closer to trusting her and had just been handed 17 reasons to step back. "Do you believe her?" Elizabeth said. "I believe," Eleanor said slowly, "that she presented information that is factually accurate in a framing designed to look damaging." "The information is accurate," Elizabeth said. "My father is writing those letters. I asked him to. I will not deny that." Eleanor looked at her. "I asked him to," Elizabeth said again steadily, "because I looked at that ledger and I saw a problem, that I had something, not money, not land, not a name, but something that might help, and I used it." She paused. "Charlotte says that makes me calculating. Maybe it does, but what would it say about me if I saw someone She stopped, steadied. "If I saw someone I cared about with a problem I could help address, and I did nothing because I was worried about how helping would look." Eleanor was very still. "Charlotte Pembroke has never done anything in her life that wasn't calculated," Elizabeth said. "The dinner invitation was calculated. The seating was calculated. Every whisper she has put into circulation since July has been calculated. The difference is that her calculations are designed to take things from people. Mine are—" She paused. "Mine are because I cannot watch someone I care about struggle when I have something to offer." Silence. "Tell me something," Eleanor said. Her voice was different now, not the formal register, not the assessment voice, something quieter. "When you asked your father to write those letters, did Nathaniel know?" "Yes," Elizabeth said. Eleanor blinked. "I showed him what I was thinking before I spoke to my father," Elizabeth said. "I told him exactly what I intended to do and why. I asked him whether he wanted me to. He said yes." She met Eleanor's eyes. "Because that is what we agreed to, that we would be honest with each other, even when honesty was inconvenient." Eleanor looked at her for a long moment. Then she sat down. She sat in the chair near the window, the one Eleanor herself had chosen, the good straight-back chair of a woman who preferred to meet things directly, and she put her hands in her lap and she looked at them. "My nephew's father," Eleanor said, "was a man who never asked for help. In 50 years of marriage, he never once allowed my sister to assist with a business decision. She was brilliant, far cleverer than he was at trade, and he would not hear it." She paused. "They were not unhappy. But they lost things they did not need to lose, because he believed that a man's strength was measured by what he managed alone." Elizabeth waited. "Nathaniel is very like him in some ways," Eleanor said. The closed face, the long silences, the conviction that difficulty is something to be carried without burden. She looked up. "He is not like him in one way." "What way?" Elizabeth said. "He let you see the ledger," Eleanor said. The words landed quietly, simply. Eleanor stood again. She smoothed the front of her dress with the brisk, finished gesture of a woman concluding something. "I am going to write to Charlotte Pembroke," she said, "and inform her that I found her information yesterday evening to be both accurate and irrelevant, and that I do not intend to discuss the Whitmore family's private matters with her again." She picked up her gloves from the table. "And then I am going to speak to Nathaniel about the loan against the Western Quarter, because I have been too proud about that situation for too long, and it is time someone dealt with it directly." Elizabeth stood very still. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said. Eleanor looked at her. "Thank you," Elizabeth said. Eleanor studied her for a moment. "Don't thank me yet," she said. "I am still adjusting my understanding of several things." She paused. "But I will say this. My sister Nathaniel's mother, she would have liked you. She had very little patience for rooms full of people deciding what other people were worth." A brief pause. "She would have liked you very much." It was the closest thing to a blessing Elizabeth was going to get. She understood that. It was enough. She walked back to the print shop with the morning sun coming in hard and bright off the street, and the sound of Richmond starting its day around her carts and voices, and the smell of bread from the bakery on the corner, and she felt the particular quality of a day that had shifted when she wasn't watching. The kind of shift that didn't announce itself, but was visible when you looked back at it. She had not won anything exactly. Charlotte was not finished. Eleanor's adjusting was not finished. The loan was still due in 8 months. The Western Quarter was still underused. The whispers that had been circulating for 2 months did not simply stop because someone chose not to add to them. None of it was fixed, but it was different. She pushed open the door of the print shop. Her father looked up from the press. "Well," he said. "She's writing to Charlotte," Elizabeth said. Her father absorbed this. Then he nodded slowly with the expression of a man who had read enough news in 30 years to understand when a tide was turning, even before the shore felt it. "I heard from James Kellner this morning," he said. "He's willing to meet." Elizabeth stopped walking. "When?" she said. "End of the month," her father said. "I told him a representative of the Whitmore estate would be in touch directly." He paused. "I assumed that was all right." She looked at her father, at the ink on his hands, at the lines in his face, at the 30 years of building something true in a world that preferred performance. "It's all right," she said. "I also," her father said, somewhat more carefully, "may have mentioned in my letter that the Courier would be covering the Eastern County trade expansion in our autumn series, and that Kellner's operation might be a good example to feature." Elizabeth stared at him. "Papa, I am a newspaper man," he said mildly. "I see stories where stories exist. That is completely transparent." "Yes," he agreed, and Kellner wrote back within 2 days. He picked up his coffee. "Transparency is underrated." She laughed. She didn't plan to, it came up from somewhere, the real kind, the kind that comes when tension releases and something warm fills the space it leaves. Her father smiled at his cup. She sat down at the composing table and picked up her work. For a while, the only sound was the familiar noise of the print shop, the press, the type blocks, the scratch of her father's notes on paper. The ordinary music of their ordinary life, which had held her through everything that had come before this, and would hold her through what came next. She was setting type for the next edition when her father said without looking up, "He's coming by this afternoon, Nathaniel." Her hands slowed. "I know," she said. "You might want to be the one to tell him about Kellner." She set a type block into place. "I was planning to," she said. Her father hummed. She recognized the tune, her mother's favorite. He hummed it when he was satisfied with how something was going. He probably didn't know he was doing it. She did not tell him. She let him hum. Nathaniel arrived at 3 in the afternoon. He came in with the quiet purposefulness she knew well by now, the walk of a man who had decided where he was going and was going there. He looked, she thought, slightly different than he had when she'd first begun noticing him. Not different in any obvious way, but less contracted. Like a door that had been shut against the weather for a long time and had been opened carefully, window by window, until the air moved through it freely again. He stopped at the counter. She looked at him. "James Kellner wrote back," she said. His face did something immediate and unguarded, the same thing it had done when she'd laughed in Morrison Hall, that brief, undefended quality. "When?" he said. "This morning. He's willing to meet. End of the month." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Elizabeth." "Don't," she said. "Don't thank me. My father wrote the letter. Kellner responded. The meeting will be yours to take from there." "That's not why I said your name," he said. She looked at him. He came around the counter past the formal space into her side of it, and he stood in front of her, and he looked at her with the full, unguarded directness that was still, even now, slightly startling in its honesty. "I have been trying," he said carefully, "to think of the right way to say something to you, for some weeks." He paused. "I am not practiced at this." "I know," she said. I am aware that my family has been difficult, he said, that Charlotte has been deliberately harmful, that none of the circumstances of the past 2 months have been what either of us would have chosen. No, she agreed. And I am aware, he continued, that you have handled all of it with more grace and more practical intelligence than anyone had a right to expect. He stopped. I do not want you to think that I take that for granted, or that I take you for granted. She held his gaze. And I need you to know, he said, that when I stand beside you at the Morrison gathering, or at any gathering, or on any street in this city, it is not because I am making a statement, or managing impressions, or doing anything except being where I want to be. The print shop was very still. Nathaniel, she said. I am not finished, he said. She closed her mouth. I know I have nothing elegant to offer you right now, he said. I have an estate that is financially strained, and a family that is still adjusting, and a history I have been carrying for 6 years, that I am only now beginning to put down. I know what that looks like from the outside. He paused. But I also know that the past 2 months have been the first time since Thomas died that I have felt present. Actually present. In my own life. He looked at her directly. That is because of you. Elizabeth did not move. I am not asking you for anything you are not prepared to give, he said. I am not asking you to decide anything today. I am simply telling you what is true, because you asked me for honesty, and I have been trying to give it to you, and this is the most honest thing I have. The room breathed around them, ink and paper, and her father's quiet presence somewhere in the back. Elizabeth looked at Nathaniel Whitmore, at the hands that had been closed for 6 years and had reached for her anyway, at the face that had learned over the past 2 months to let things land on it instead of deflecting them, at the man who had put a ledger of his failures on her counter because he believed she deserved to see the truth. I know, she said. You know, he repeated. I've known for a while, she said. I was waiting for you to catch up. Something broke open in his face. That real unguarded thing, the one that was not quite a smile and was better than a smile. You might have told me, he said. You needed to get there yourself, she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he reached for her hand. Not with the urgency of the dinner table, not with the deliberate public statement of the Morrison gathering. Just simply, the way you reach for something you have decided is yours to hold. She let him. They stood in the print shop in the afternoon light with the type blocks and the press and 30 years of her father's honest work around them, and the loan still due in 8 months, and Charlotte Pembroke still in Richmond, and Eleanor Whitmore still adjusting her understanding of several things, and the entire complicated machinery of the world still turning around them exactly as it always had. None of it was fixed, but his hand was warm in hers, and she thought that was for today exactly enough. Her father appeared in the doorway. He looked at them. He looked at the joined hands on the counter. He looked at Elizabeth. She looked back at him with an expression that said plainly without words, Yes, this, I've decided. He nodded once. Then he turned back into the press room and started humming again. The Kellner meeting changed things faster than anyone expected. James Kellner arrived in Richmond on the last Friday of August, a broad, practical man in his mid-40s who had inherited his father's operation and his father's instinct for recognizing a good partnership when it was sitting across a table from him. He met with Nathaniel at the Whitmore estate for 3 hours. Elizabeth was not there for the meeting itself. This was Nathaniel's territory, Nathaniel's negotiation, and she had been careful from the beginning not to blur that line. But she knew the moment it ended because Nathaniel rode directly from the estate to the print shop without stopping home first, which was not something a man did when a meeting had gone badly. He came through the door and looked at her and said, He wants to re-establish the full trading relationship, terms better than what his father had originally offered. Elizabeth set down her quill. Better, she said. He read the pieces the courier ran about his father's operation. Nathaniel said. He said his father kept them. Had them framed in the office. A pause. He said that any partner vouched for by a paper his father trusted was a partner worth having. The room was very still. Then Elizabeth said, "My father is going to be insufferable about this." Nathaniel almost smiled. "He has earned it." She stood up and came around the composing table and stood in front of him and looked at his face, at the quality of it, the particular looseness around his eyes that she had learned meant something had released in him rather than contracted further. "This solves the immediate problem," she said. "Not everything." "No," he agreed. "But enough." He paused. "The loan on the Western Quarter with the Kellner income re-established, we can renegotiate the timeline. My aunt has agreed to advance a portion against the estate's long-term holdings. It gives us room." Us. He had said us without noting it. She noticed it. She chose not to say anything about it yet. "The Western Quarter itself," she said. "Have you thought more about what to do with it?" "Timber," he said. "There's a mill operation 2 counties over that has been looking for reliable supply. I spoke with them last week." He looked at her. "I have been busy." "I see that," she said. "I have been taking windows," he said. She looked at him for a moment. Then she laughed. "The real kind, the full kind." And he watched it happen with an expression that was open and warm and entirely unlike the man who had sat beside her at Charlotte Pembroke's dinner table and looked at a fixed point across the room. "Good," she said. Her father appeared in the doorway of the back room. He looked at Nathaniel. He looked at Elizabeth. He read the room the way he'd been reading rooms for 30 years. "Kellner," he said. "Full re-establishment," Nathaniel said. "Better terms." Her father said nothing. He just nodded once with the contained satisfaction of a man who had planted something and watched it grow and was not going to make a ceremony of it. Then he went back to the press, but Elizabeth heard him humming before the door swung shut. 3 weeks later, Charlotte Pembroke made her last move. Elizabeth had almost stopped watching for it. That was, she understood afterward, exactly what Charlotte had been counting on: the period of relative calm. The sense that the battle had shifted, the careful loosening of vigilance that comes when things are going better than expected. Charlotte had been waiting for that loosening. It came in the form of a letter. Not whispers this time, not a dinner party maneuver. An actual letter delivered to the Richmond Courier and addressed to Elizabeth's father, signed by Charlotte Pembroke herself, which meant she was no longer hiding behind indirection. She was in the open now, and the fact that she had stepped into the open meant she believed she had something definitive. The letter stated in Charlotte's precise and careful prose that she was writing as a concerned member of the community to inform Mr. Carter that his daughter's association with Nathaniel Whitmore had become a matter of public discussion, and that several prominent families had expressed concern about the Courier's impartiality given the paper's apparent financial involvement with the Whitmore estate's business recovery. It was elegant. It was devastating. Because it did not attack Elizabeth's character directly, she had tried that, and it had not worked. It attacked the Courier. It threatened the one thing that Elizabeth would never risk for her own sake: her father's reputation. 30 years of impartiality. 30 years of a Richmond community trusting the paper precisely because it was not allied with any particular family's interests. Charlotte had found the real pressure point. Elizabeth's father read the letter twice. Then he set it on the table and looked at it for a long time. Elizabeth stood across from him. "Papa," she said. "Don't," he said, not unkindly. "Just stop." She stopped. He was quiet for long enough that the press noise from the back filled the silence and faded. Then he picked up the letter again. "She's not wrong," he said. The words landed like cold water. "Papa." "She is not wrong that we have been involved," he said. "I wrote letters on the Whitmore estate's behalf. That is a fact. The question is whether that involvement compromised our reporting." He looked up. "Has it?" Elizabeth held his gaze. "We haven't run a single piece about the Whitmore estate," she said. "We have not mentioned Nathaniel's name in print. The Kellner story I am writing is about Eastern County trade expansion. It involves 17 different operations. The Whitmore estate is one of them, mentioned in the same terms as the others." Her father looked at her. "So the answer," she said steadily, "is no." He held the letter. He held her gaze. Then he said, "Write that piece." She blinked. "I am writing it." "Finish it," he said. "Run it this week. Full coverage, all 17 operations. Whitmore among them with the same column inches as the others. Not more, not less." He set the letter down. "And then I am going to write a response to Charlotte Pembroke." "What are you going to say?" Elizabeth said. Her father looked at her with the expression he had worn on the day she had first come to work beside him at the press. Not proud exactly, but something that went deeper than pride. Certain. "I'm going to say," he said, "that the Richmond Courier has covered this community's commercial and civic life for 30 years without fear or favor, and that we intend to continue doing so. And that if Mrs. Pembroke has specific evidence of editorial compromise, she is welcome to present it, and we will address it publicly." He paused. "She doesn't have evidence, because there isn't any." Elizabeth was quiet. "And then," her father said, "I am going to print both letters, side by side, hers and mine." Elizabeth stared at him. "You're going to print her letter?" "With her permission, which she will not withhold, because refusing would look worse than agreeing," he said. "And readers will see both, Charlotte's accusation and our response, in the same column." He picked up his coffee. "I have been running this paper for 30 years by letting people read the whole story. This is the whole story." Elizabeth looked at her father, at the ink on his hands, at the 30 years of decisions that had built the thing Charlotte was now trying to use against them. "She thought this would stop us," Elizabeth said. "She thought the threat would be enough," her father said. "She did not account for the fact that we have never responded to threats by doing less." He looked at his daughter. "We do more." Elizabeth squared her shoulders. "I'll finish the piece today," she said. The piece ran Thursday. The paired letters ran Friday. By Saturday morning, 3 things had happened. First, James Kellner had sent a brief note to the Courier confirming that his family had been subscribers for 20 years and that he found the paper's coverage of the Eastern County trade situation to be the most accurate and fair-minded he had read. He had not been asked to write this note. He wrote it because he wanted to. Second, Mrs. Morrison had called on Charlotte Pembroke personally. The details of this conversation were known only to the 2 women. But Mrs. Morrison emerged from the visit with an expression of complete satisfaction that she did not trouble to conceal. Third, and most significantly, Eleanor Whitmore, who had extended her Richmond stay now to nearly 4 weeks, walked into the Richmond Courier on Saturday morning, asked for Elizabeth's father, and sat down across from him at the composing table. Elizabeth was in the back. She heard the conversation, but could not make out every word. She heard her father's voice measured warm. She heard Eleanor's voice careful, less formal than it had been in the beginning. When Eleanor left 40 minutes later, she stopped in the doorway of the back room where Elizabeth was working. "Your father," Eleanor said, "is going to write a piece about the Whitmore estate's history for the autumn series." Elizabeth looked up from the type she was setting. "He mentioned it to me," Eleanor said. "I told him I would provide whatever historical documents he needed." A pause. "I also told him that if he ran it with the same quality as his piece on the Kellner operation, I would personally ensure it reached every significant household in 2 counties. Elizabeth set down the type block. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said. "I have been sitting on the wrong side of this for too long," Eleanor said without warmth or drama, simply as a statement of fact. "I am correcting my position." She put on her gloves. "Nathaniel is coming to dinner at the Morrison house tonight," she said. "I would like you to come as well." She paused. "Both you and your father." It was not exactly an apology. It was not exactly an invitation. It was Eleanor Whitmore in her own language saying, "I see you. I was wrong about what I saw. I am adjusting." "We'll be there," Elizabeth said. Eleanor nodded once. Then she was gone. The dinner was quiet and good and real, in a way that the Pembroke gathering with all its silk and calculation had never been. Mrs. Morrison's table was not elaborate. The food was honest. The conversation moved between 4 people who were learning in different ways how to speak plainly with each other. Nathaniel sat beside Elizabeth. Not across from her, not at the opposite end of the table beside her. He did not announce it or explain it. He simply sat there, and Eleanor across the table looked at the two of them together and said nothing, which was its own kind of statement. After dinner, Nathaniel and Elizabeth walked outside together. The evening was warm, still, the last warmth of summer holding on against the coming season, and they walked in silence for a while. The comfortable kind. The kind that had been building between them since a street in August when he'd stood with his hat in his hands and told her the truth about his brother. "She's coming around," Elizabeth said. "She came around 2 weeks ago," Nathaniel said. "She's just slow to admit it. It runs in the family." Elizabeth looked at him. "Does it?" "I was the same way," he said. "About you." "You wrote me a letter after 5 days," she said. "That was very fast for me," he said seriously. She laughed. He stopped walking. She stopped too, and turned to look at him, and found him standing with the expression she had catalogued across the past months. Not the almost smile, not the open warmth, not the unguarded quality that still startled her sometimes. Something else. Something new. The face of a man who had decided something and was done deliberating. "I want to ask you something," he said. She waited. "I am aware," he said, "that the situation is not what anyone would call straightforward. The estate is recovering, but not recovered. My family is adjusting, but not adjusted. Charlotte Pembroke is quiet, but not finished." He paused. "And I am a man who spent 6 years learning how to be absent, and am only now learning how to be present." "I know all of this," she said. "I know you know," he said. "I want you to know that I know you know. I want you to know that I am not asking with any illusion about the complications." She looked at him. "Nathaniel," she said, "what are you asking?" He reached into his coat. He brought out a ring. Simple. A thin gold band with a small dark stone, not elaborate. Nothing like what the daughters of Richmond's great families received. Something quiet. Something that had the quality of something chosen rather than displayed. "This was my mother's," he said. "Eleanor brought it when she came. She told me she had been carrying it since she arrived, waiting to see—" He paused. "Waiting to see whether you were who she thought you might be." Elizabeth looked at the ring, then at him. "And," she said, "she gave it to me 3 days ago," he said. "She said to stop waiting until the circumstances were perfect." A beat. She said perfect circumstances were a myth people used to avoid committing to real ones. Elizabeth was very still. "Elizabeth Carter," Nathaniel said, "I am asking you to marry me. Not because the circumstances are easy, not because everything is settled, but because you are the person I want beside me while everything is being settled, and I do not want to spend any more of my life being absent from things that matter." The evening air around them was warm and still. Elizabeth looked at the ring in his hand, at the simple gold, at the man who had held his mother's ring for 3 days waiting for the right moment, and had chosen an ordinary evening walk after an honest dinner, rather than any staged occasion because he was— She thought, finally learning that the real moments were always the ordinary ones. "Yes," she said. Not elaborate, not dramatic. Just yes. He put the ring on her finger. His hands were steady. She noticed that. The hands that had reached for her at the dinner table and had not wanted to let go steady, certain present. "Together," he said, quietly. "Together," she said. 1 year later, Elizabeth Carter walked into the Pembroke summer gathering as Elizabeth Whitmore. Mrs. Morrison had told her afterward that Charlotte had known about the marriage for 2 months and had spent those 2 months deciding how to receive it publicly. That Charlotte had considered not attending her own gathering, then decided that absence would look worse than presence, then spent a week planning what to say and how to look when Elizabeth walked in. None of that planning accounted for what actually happened. What actually happened was this. Elizabeth walked in a dress that was not repaired at the cuffs, a soft ivory that her father had insisted on as a wedding gift and Margaret had helped choose, and Nathaniel walked beside her. Not behind her, not ahead of her. Beside her. The room shifted the way rooms shift when something changes the geometry of everyone's expectations at once. People who had watched Elizabeth Carter navigate these gatherings with her chin lifted and her dignity intact and her mended blue dress brushed clean, those people went still. Not unkindly still, recognizingly still. The kind of stillness that acknowledges when something has arrived at its proper place. Eleanor Whitmore was already there. She saw them come in and she nodded once firmly with the expression of a woman whose adjustment was complete and who was now simply participating in what was. Mrs. Haverford crossed the room to greet them before anyone else moved. She took Elizabeth's hands, looked at her face and said, "You look exactly like yourself, only more so." Elizabeth felt something warm bloom in her chest. "Thank you," she said. "That's the kindest thing anyone could say." Charlotte Pembroke appeared across the room. The moment was going to come. Elizabeth had always known it would. You could not share a town with someone who had fought you this deliberately and this long without one final accounting between you, some moment where the room held its breath and waited to see how both women stood. Charlotte moved through the guests toward them. Her expression was composed, unreadable to most people. But Elizabeth had spent a year learning Charlotte Pembroke's particular language, and she could see beneath the composure, beneath the performance, that Charlotte had arrived at something she had not expected to arrive at. Not defeat, exactly. Something more complicated than defeat. The expression of a person who fought hard for a thing and watched the thing happen anyway, and has had to spend a year deciding what that means. Charlotte stopped in front of them. She looked at Elizabeth. She looked at Nathaniel. "Mr. Whitmore," she said. "Mrs. Whitmore." Nathaniel inclined his head. "Mrs. Pembroke." A pause. Charlotte looked at Elizabeth for a long moment. Something moved in her face. Something Elizabeth could not fully name, something that had more layers than any single word could carry. "You look well," Charlotte said. "I am well," Elizabeth said. "The Courier's autumn series was very well received," Charlotte said. "I read the piece about the Eastern County trade expansion." A pause, small barely there. "It was good work." Elizabeth looked at her steadily. "Thank you," she said, simply, without triumph, without edge, because Charlotte Pembroke had done her worst, and the worst had not been enough, and Elizabeth did not need to celebrate that. She had never needed Charlotte to be diminished. She had only ever needed to stand. Charlotte nodded once. Then she moved away into the room back toward the guests who were her natural territory. Nathaniel beside Elizabeth said quietly, "That was gracious of you." "She lost," Elizabeth said equally quietly. "That's enough." He looked at her. "You have never wanted anyone to be humiliated," he said. It was not a question. "No," she said. "Only to be honest." She glanced at him. "Speaking of which, Eleanor is heading toward the Haverford table, which means she is about to corner someone into a practical conversation about county commerce, and I believe you promised Mrs. Morrison you would rescue her guests from your aunt before 9 o'clock. "I did say that," Nathaniel acknowledged. "It's 8:30. He squeezed her hand. "I'll handle Eleanor." "I know you will," she said. He moved toward his aunt. Elizabeth stood for a moment in the center of the room that had been designed 1 year ago to humiliate her. The table at which she had sat in her mended blue dress while 40 people waited for her to break. The house in which a servant had spilled wine and a man who did not reach for anyone had reached for her. She was wearing a different dress now. The table was the same. The room was the same. She was the same exactly herself as Mrs. Haverford had said, only more so. Not transformed, not elevated, not rescued. She had not needed to be any of those things. She had only needed to stay. Margaret appeared at her elbow, as Margaret always appeared suddenly from the direction least expected, with an expression of complete satisfaction and a glass of lemonade. "Well," Margaret said. "Well," Elizabeth agreed. Charlotte looked like she swallowed something unpleasant. "Charlotte looked like a woman who lost," Elizabeth said, "which she did, and she'll be fine." Margaret tilted her head. "You are a generous soul." I'm a practical one, Elizabeth said. Generous is different. You're both, Margaret said. Don't argue with me. Elizabeth looked around the room, at Eleanor gesturing at something across the Haverford table, while the people around her listened with the expression of people learning something despite themselves. At Mrs. Morrison near the doorway, with her characteristic expression of calm authority. At Nathaniel, who had reached his aunt and was guiding her gently but firmly toward the topic she was supposed to be discussing, rather than the ones she preferred. At the room full of people who had spent a year updating their understanding of who Elizabeth Carter was, who Elizabeth Whitmore was. She thought about her mother, who had brought her to the literacy program in this building when she was too small to read, believing she would learn faster surrounded by people who thought it mattered. She thought about her father humming her mother's song over the press that morning when she'd told him she was going to the Pembroke gathering with Nathaniel. She thought about a handkerchief with the initials N.W. pressed into the corner sitting under her mother's Bible in a drawer she no longer needed to close. She thought about a hand steady and certain closing over hers, not because she needed saving, not because the room expected it, but because a man who had spent 6 years learning to be absent had finally decided to stay. He's watching you, Margaret said. Elizabeth didn't turn. I know. He's been watching you since you walked in. I know that too. How does it feel, Margaret said, to be looked at like that? Elizabeth considered it. The real answer, the honest one, not the decorative version that required the right words, but the plain, true version that lived underneath. Like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be, she said. She raised her eyes across the room. Nathaniel was watching her, not the room, not his aunt, not the social performance happening around him. Her. With the full, unguarded present attention of a man who had come back from 6 years of absence and had no intention of leaving again. He lifted his chin slightly. The language of, "Are you all right?" She nodded once. The language of yes. Go handle your aunt. The corner of his mouth moved. She smiled. And in the ballroom of the Pembroke Mansion, in the summer of 1818, surrounded by the same people who had once watched her walk toward a seat designed to make her feel small, Elizabeth Whitmore stood in her own skin, in her own name, in her own life, and understood something that Charlotte Pembroke, with all her silk and strategy, had never figured out. A room full of people could decide what you were worth. They could whisper it, print it, perform it at every table in Richmond, but they could only make it true if you let them. She had never let them. And the hand that had once been used to humiliate her, the seating card pressed into her palm with a blade-sharp smile designed to deliver her to her own embarrassment, had instead delivered her to the man who had reached across that table and held on. Not despite the room, because of who they both chose to be inside it. That was the whole story. That was enough.